I want to be careful in my words, but once our teams have fully gone through everything, I wouldn't be the least surprised if the fraud squad wasn't called in certain cases.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm James Heale and I'm delighted to be joined today by Zia Yusuf, the chairman of Reform UK. Now Zia, welcome to The Spectator. Thanks for coming today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Well, first of all, just talk, I know it's obviously an hour, 10 days ago, but how well did you do at the local elections compared to the expectations?
Well, I think this will go down in history as the most important set of local elections ever in the United Kingdom, primarily because the stranglehold that the two old parties have had on British politics has not only been broken, it's been decisively shattered. And that is a huge debt of gratitude we have to all of our volunteers and our branches and our activists and, of course, the millions of people who turned out to vote for reform. And the reason they are doing that is because for pretty much my whole life, it has really not mattered which of the two old parties you voted for. You basically got open borders, the subordination of the rights of citizens of the United Kingdom to the rights of foreign citizens, basically a complete abdication of responsibility to enforce laws that already exist. Real wages have done nothing in 2 decades. So what they see in reform is a actually viable alternative. They see Nigel, someone who has been in the public eye for 30 years. People actually know him much better than any other political leader, and they like what they see. So we're very conscious now that we have a responsibility to discharge our mandate inside the councils that we do control. And while the levers of power at local government absolutely pale in comparison to the ones that Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper and Ed Miliband at their disposal, but make no mistake, we will pull on those levers with all of our might. In terms of how we performed relative to expectations, remember Reform last May stood in just 12% of the seats that were up. This May, we stood in 99.6% of the seats that were up. We won 32% of the vote and we won 42% of the seats. And so we're now at the stage, nobody knows more about how unfair the first past the post system can be to small parties or insurgent parties than Nigel Farage. But I've been saying for a while, we have long passed the threshold at which point that system encumbers us and rather it favours us. As I said, we won 32% of the vote, 42% of the vote share. Myself, Nigel, and the team at HQ, and of course our activists have worked tirelessly over the last 10, 11 months to build an election-winning machine. And probably what should worry our enemies most is not the strength of that machine as it is currently. And we're very proud of the results that we just delivered, but it will be twice as powerful come next summer when we fight Wales, Scotland, and another 4,500 seats.
And in terms of what you've discovered since taking over those 10 authorities, and you're the largest party on, I think, 4 more as well. What has been sort of the things that have surprised you since getting to grips with local government? Because it's been a while, I think, perhaps since we saw a change like this with so many swathes of councils coming under a different party control. What have you sort of shone the spotlight on?
Well, look, at the moment, what we're doing is the groups of councillors all choosing their own leader.
Yeah.
That's important. And we're going to go through an accelerated period of discovery. We're going to really try to understand the ground truths of what's happening in these decision-making bodies. We're going to really push and prod in lots of different areas just to understand, okay, where is all this money going? I mean, I personally spent many, many hours pouring through the Freedom of Information requests that our team submitted. We submitted thousands of Freedom of Information requests prior to the election. That's where we discovered Lancashire County Council spent £500,000 on ergonomic chairs, even though the majority of their staff work from home. We found out some councils are spending over £1 million on free vapes for their constituents. Another spent £500,000 on a finger-wagging nanny state campaign to tell their constituents to brush their teeth. All the while, bin collections are getting less frequent and being threatened to become less frequent. All the while, potholes are never fixed and continue to get worse. In fact, it's worse than not even trying to fix them. They close the roads. Everybody listening to this knows that they close the roads. They then do a botched job using completely the wrong materials, and then they close the roads again a few months later. So a lot of what we're doing is discovery, and I'll give you a few examples of things that have already come to light. So if you look at potholes, it remains a abject mystery to many people in this country how millions of pounds can be spent on fixing potholes and yet, or rather not fixing potholes. It turns out the answer is quite straightforward, and it might be quite intuitive for people who understand business, but whistleblowers have already come forward and pointed out that in many cases, probably half the councils in this country, there's a tier one supplier contractor for these to maintain the roads, and what that tier one supplier does is they subcontract the pothole repair. Now, if you were spending your own money, James, on some construction work or getting your driveway done, you wouldn't just pay the builders on a day rate and just go, get it done whenever you can. And if it falls apart a few weeks later, no harm done. You would have a timeline, and that all of that would be in the quote, and there'd be some kind of expectation of quality and guarantee. The subcontractor that are writ large now not repairing these potholes are being paid day rates with no incentive to actually get it done on any sensible timeline, and no quality guarantee, which means that if they disintegrates again in 3 weeks' time, in fact, you're incentivized to do a bad job because then you get called in on a day rate again. And that's why modern technology, I mean, we're all about championing British companies wherever we can. JCB have this product called the Pothole Pro. It can dig and repair and finish faster than any other machine from what we can tell in the world. Even Chinese competitors can't get close to it. The reason why, so some councils have bought them, they're almost not used at all. So these machines actually have telemetrics inside them, so you can actually tell how much they're being used. They're almost universally massively underutilized. Why? Why would you want to use cutting edge technology to do things quickly and in a solid way when your incentives are completely the opposite? So it's a hugely maligned system. And we're not claiming all of these will be easy fixes, but we're going to leave no stone unturned to understand, firstly, what the hell is going on. And then we're going to start to do whatever we can to make procurement at local government fair and transparent. The whole DEI racket is appalling. I mean, in Durham, I'm also finding, James, that there's a real kind of quite sinister Orwellian element to the way these local governments are run. So in Durham, there is a neighbourhoods and climate change team. Now, that neighbourhoods team is simultaneously responsible for bin collections, which I think we'd all accept. Yeah. That's an important use of council tax. But they've snuck in climate change. Yeah. And now we have a walloping mandate from the people of Durham to end all of that stuff. And we know the trap that they've set, which is, look at big bad reform coming in to attack bin collectors. No. We just want to understand what on earth is that money being spent on? Why is some Greta Thunberg agenda that has now long been, there's no mandate in Durham for, being discharged with taxpayers' money? So these are the sorts of things we're already finding. In Kent County Council, we've talked about now this, we've got a great group of lawyers led by a KC who are working for free, completely pro bono, from their chambers in order to bring cases to resist the dispersal of illegal migrants into reform-controlled council communities. We've already heard somebody from the Kent County Council legal team stood up and said, our lawyers are going to be working really hard to resist what reform are doing. So you have this insane situation. We've talked a lot about the blob and all of the kind of the immune response that exists in the bureaucracy at every level in this country that's been totally captured, frankly, by, I'd actually call them Marxist elements that are actively working against the interests of constituents. So you have this insane situation where you have a walloping mandate handed to reform to resist asylum hotels and their taxpayer money being spent inside Kent County Council at the behest of their legal team to resist it. So again, number one, we're going to highlight this stuff, and then we're going to do everything we can to completely reverse those trends.
And in terms of how much scope you can actually do to undo a lot of this stuff, what's your initial assessment? Because as I say, obviously only been running these authorities for just over a week now. But in terms of, is it more about sort of the active resistance and highlighting waste, or is it actually going to be about ensuring that, for instance, asylum seekers cannot be put in these sort of places where you control?
What we can commit to, and what we're working really hard to do, is use every instrument of power available to us and pull on those levers of power as hard as we can. And we've got to be realistic that the Home Secretary has awesome power in this country. Yvette Cooper is able to do things that no one in local government can, even if they have the best lawyers in the country as we do. However, I do believe that we will be able to at the very least delay a lot of these projects. And the law is on our side, make no mistake. The only reason we might lose some of those cases is because the Home Secretary has a fail-safe cheat code available to her. And that fail-safe cheat code, by the way, has been used to an industrial scale to betray the British people. So no, we are going to make changes. We're going to eliminate these DEI rules. You had Lincolnshire, Andrea Jenkins had a whole raft of mainstream media attacks on her because she said we were going to eliminate DEI rules in Lincolnshire. And even the BBC said, we asked Lincolnshire County Council and they said they have no DEI officers. And apparently that was the end of what BBC felt were their journalistic responsibilities. They just took that as given. I'll tell you why that is because if you go and look at, anyone can go to any of these councils' websites and go to Freedom of Information requests. And anytime they respond to somebody, there's a lot, right? There's like a whole load of activists and think tanks, all frankly, doing great work to try to get to the bottom of what's going on. And there's only so much you can do from the outside. And so what's happening is councils realise that there were so many of these requests coming in, so they're just giving them different job titles. And you'd better be, you can fully expect reform council leaders to ultimately be able to identify, how much money is actually being spent on these projects, how many roles are there. And look, we're not saying everyone doing those jobs are bad people, but it is the democratic process has worked, and there is a resounding mandate, I'm afraid, to eliminate those roles, and that is what we will do.
And how much, can you give us a sort of ballpark figure, do you think that we saved from cutting back these roles? I think Andrea spoke about sort of 10% savings. Is that a sort of fair target?
Well, look, I think number one, there are some elements of the savings that can be made which are really important to do because they prevent the further ideological corrosion inside this country, right? As opposed to big percentage savings. If we know, nobody's more aware than we are, that there are enormous budgetary pressures on local government. The majority of local government spending is statutory and is related to social care. Now, if we get to where the really big numbers are going to be saved ultimately, you do need to look at areas like social care. But I want to be really clear about something. If you are a parent with, for example, a child with special educational needs inside a reform-controlled council, you have absolutely nothing to fear from a reform-controlled council. Your children will get to school and they will get to school on time. But if you look at how much is being spent per head, I mean, you could pretty much afford to use Uber's Lux service and still save 20 to 30% from what we can tell. Most of the contracts being handed out, again, we can only go on the information we have from having been previously on the outside. These are multi-million-pound contracts going to local taxi companies with one bidder. Now, again, if you were spending your own money, and this is, again, a commitment we have, inside reform councils, we will look to spend taxpayers' money the same way we would spend our own. And by the way, even if you were getting a taxi to the airport, most people listening to this program would call more than one company, right? So it is an abomination that procurement is being done in, at the very least, a grossly incompetent way. I want to be careful in my words, but once our teams have fully gone through everything, I wouldn't be the least surprised if the fraud squad wasn't called in certain cases. But again, I want to be clear that there are big budgetary pressures on local councils. We know we have to deliver for people locally. But by the way, people in this country are not all about saying, I want to pay no tax.
No.
They're not even against the idea that their council tax might need to increase occasionally.
No, you didn't promise anything on council tax, which versus the Conservatives who made that their central issue.
Correct. What they're focused on, though, is what they cannot fathom is how they're being told, in some councils, their council tax is going up 30%. This is another crazy thing, James, about incentives, right? So Warren Buffett's business partner, Charlie Munger, passed away not too long ago, very wise man. And he had a phrase which is up on the wall at the company that I used to run, which is, show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes. Now, it's all about bankruptcy, right? So in business, if you're an executive team, you have a pretty big disincentive to go bankrupt. Generally, you lose your job. Generally, you lose all your stock options, and you suffer significantly reputationally. So that's why, at the very least, businesses will try not to go bankrupt, and executives will do what they can to prevent it. Literally the opposite is true at council level. So there are statutory limits on how much your council can raise council tax on you, but there's a caveat. They go bankrupt. If you declare bankruptcy, raise your taxes as much as you want. And whenever that has happened, and it's happening with ridiculous frequency, council taxes going up. I mean, there are councils in and around London where it's going up 30% in a single year during a cost of living crisis, while services are being cut left, right, and centre. And what happens to the executive team? I'll tell you what happens. They continue to earn £200,000 a year. And again, look, we're generally a free markets party. I personally have no issue with people earning really good money if they're doing a great job.
Yeah.
You know, when we're in government, when Nigel's Prime Minister, you can expect the size of the civil service to be dramatically reduced. I would actually expect the average salary to increase, the average total compensation. Now, I think compensation should be heavily tied to results. So if you've got a chief executive of a council that's doing a phenomenal job and delivering real value for people who live locally, I see no reason why they shouldn't earn that kind of money. What's absolutely abominable is people doing a deplorable job, bankrupting the council, so in some cases like literally every 2 to 3 years, and earning 200 grand. There's nothing about that that's remotely acceptable. And that's why actually, despite what a lot of the press and the Tories and Labour are claiming, the bar for us is not that high. If we actually turned up and said, we're going to work out what's been going wrong, we're going to highlight it, we're not going to waste your money, we're going to be very transparent. So the word transparency will be at the vanguard of everything we do. Because James, how can a Tory turn up and say, we're going to go through forensically where all the money's been going? All they'd be doing is stitching up their mate who's been running the count. I'm serious, right? It has to be a fresh pair of eyes. And people also then level a criticism of being a reform, they're ill-experienced. Well, I'm sorry, but what they're really saying is that we've had no hand in the catastrophic destruction of local communities, from a parish council all the way through to the union.
I mean, there's a line I had in my column last week where I talked about speaking to an ex-Labour minister who said, all this talk about these councils reform are going to run them badly and that'll stop them voting at the general election. The most shocking, we're talking about financial mismanagement, but the most shocking example, of course, some of those local authorities was what's occurred in the grooming gang scandal across the country. And that didn't stop, people voting Labour at the last election, for instance. So I think there's a sort of political point, but there's also a sort of general management point, which is that frankly, a lot of these authorities haven't been run particularly well. In terms of the transparency you're talking about, how are you going to sort of make the most of that in terms of will you be doing a sort of DOGE-style website as Elon Musk has done in America? How will you be bringing to light, as well as doing the regular press conferences, sort of shining a spotlight on all of this? Yeah,
so one of the things our lawyers are currently looking at is making sure, in terms of publicising things, obviously public interest is a very powerful legal maxim in this country, but absolutely, we'll have a website. We're going to have a place whistleblowers can come forward. That's already happening, by the way, in their droves. There are people who... the outpouring of emotion even, including from council employees who said, I can't believe what I've been seeing. And, you mentioned the grooming gangs, and it didn't necessarily stop people voting for Labour. I would argue grooming gangs, tragically, because it should have happened a lot earlier, has become a much bigger national issue post Keir Starmer's election last summer. And, our view on that, by the way, is that the only way you're actually going to bring true justice to the victims and hold to account everybody responsible, the monstrous perpetrators and all of the people who covered it up, who had a sworn duty to protect those girls, is a full statutory inquiry backed by severe criminal penalties if you fail to show up for questioning. And to do that, we need Nigel to be the Prime Minister with a reform majority. But again, our commitment is whatever we can do locally, we will. And beyond that, in terms of transparency, there's loads of other things you can do. Let's look at potholes, right? So one of the things we are planning around potholes is everybody knows in their bones that millions of pounds are spent on potholes in their local community and they're never fixed. But they don't have data on that. Why? And already I can tell you our attempts to get to that data are being obfuscated at every possible turn, right? For kind of obvious reasons. So what we'd like to do is have a potholes dashboard and be able to see, there's things you can do, for example, if hypothetically there were LiDAR detectors on the front of, let's imagine there was a vehicle, that councils had vehicles traversing pretty much all public roads in the area. And there were LiDAR detectors on the front of those. You would then have real-time visibility on where the potholes were and how severe they were. Now, there are some things called bin trucks, and I know their journeys around local roads, sadly, are becoming less frequent, but they do happen. So the vision we have, ultimately, and I'm not saying this can all happen overnight, is full transparency on where the potholes are.
Yeah.
We can then go through all the contracts, and instead of hiding these contracts behind, the myriad of FOI and, having to use FOI requests to get to them, no, we'll be very transparent about, okay, these are the current contracts. Most of them are 5-year contracts, minimum 3. And we're going to be able to, you're going to be able to see every pothole in a given area and how many were being fixed, if any, and how much each fix was costing. By the way, let's also talk about procurement generally at local level and nationally. I mean, my view is, and Nigel's view as well, is if you keep asking why on most problems in this country, not all, but most, procurement is the answer, is at the heart of most of the issues. Procurement is done in, at the very least, a shambolic way, and sadly, in some cases, a corrupt way. Look at PPE. Look at how many Tory cronies, who ended up getting these vast contracts and nothing was really delivered. So if you look at many of these contracts, to even be eligible to bid, you need £150 million of revenues. You can't bid if you've been around for less than 5 years. So you literally lock out. You reduce the chances to nil of any innovative companies being able to turn up and say, we want to be able to bid on these things. And again, if you actually allowed the free market to attack the pothole problem with cutting edge technology and said, for example, we're going to take a machine that is orders of magnitude faster and better repairing them, and we're going to sweat that asset. We're going to run that thing every hour of the day that you can without causing noise problems. We'll do a couple of things. You'll massively reduce the marginal cost of fixing a pothole. You'll fix them properly, so the number of repairs in a given year dramatically decline. And, really importantly, you massively reduce the time the road is closed. All of which are going to be hugely popular. And again, we're not claiming we can do all of this overnight. But, at Reform, we're pretty high agency people. We generally don't get discouraged if people tell us no the first few times. And if there are people inside the council, and by the way, we've met some great people inside the councils as well. I want to be clear about that too. But if our councillors and executive teams come up against resistance, we know, and I keep telling our council teams this, you are backed by a walloping mandate from the people, and those salaries are being paid out of the back-breaking labour in many cases of the people paying that. And so we know that we have a mission, and actually we think over the next 4 or 5 years we can do a lot of good locally.
And in terms of the teams you're sending in there, how does that work? Is it sort of a flying squad or sort of the untouchable style? You're sending them across the country in terms of dealing with procurement and sort of how is that all working in terms of the organisation between your central office in Millbank Tower and sort of the councils across the country? So
we're standing all of this up as we speak. As you said,
yeah.
We've only at the moment the councils are currently selecting their leaders, and there's obviously a process that needs to be gone through. And we'll have more to announce in due course. But we will have, for example, a DOGE team. So we'll have a number of task forces. And that DOGE team, which is a directorate rather than a department of governmental efficiency, will then consult and work with councillors and council leaders where we're in control, and of course the executive teams, and then obviously with subordinate teams within that. So, for example, in order to do maximal good in protecting reform communities inside reform control councils from these awful Serco contracts, these gilt-edged contracts, which actually in many cases are 7 years, I found out today, 7 years, massively above market rents, and they cover all costs of maintenance and repair. We are going to need, as you really should expect, the cooperation of the local council legal team. And sadly, I do expect, not in all cases, as you would expect, as has often happened when common sense comes up against the bureaucracy, I think we're going to see some resistance in some cases. But again, we will look to work through that as quickly as we can.
And how does that play out? Because you've already seen union leaders saying they want to unionise these workforces. They're not being already unionised. You're going to see people sort of learning from best practice. You'd imagine also if they're sort of, if there's sort of councillors, they will be using their political colleagues as well for advice and learning about how best to resist this. How do you overcome the bureaucracy, the vested interest, and deliver the kind of change you're talking about?
Number one, being very determined. Number two, having great lawyers. I mean, again, the KC who is leading our legal team, working on a number of these issues, is outstanding. And again, just to be really clear, they're working for free. And then it's a case of, we've really got to understand, as I said, the ground truths of what's going on. Sure. We're not about slash and burn. We're about really understanding what's going on and being really thoughtful about how do we deliver on the mandate that's just been given to us. And from what I can tell, and I think a lot of people watching this, James, know this, there's never really been any appetite from anyone in British politics to do any of this stuff. And that's why no matter whom you vote for, even the people whose hearts are in the right place, and there are some, they're relatively low agency, meaning that, they come up against some resistance, and either they lack the resolve and the determination to keep working towards the target, or they lacked support from their colleagues, / their colleagues were trying to stab them in the back, right? And so what we're focused on is, again, understanding the ground truths. We'll avail every legal remedy available to us. But look, let's also be really clear about something. If you are an employee inside a local council, and again, I want to caveat this.
Yeah.
There are a lot of great people who work in local councils, right? They are not our enemy. But if you are sitting there and thinking that you are going to be spending your time being paid for by the taxpayer, actively working against the mandate the taxpayer has just given our councillors, your time is limited inside the council, right? Your time is limited.
Put them on notice.
So that will take time, because we need to work out what's what. As I said, I keep using the phrase understanding the ground truths, understanding the real physics of the government. I mean, there are so many things, by the way, that are just normative, that have no basis in statutory law. Let's take, for example, some of our councils were told, here's the full list of portfolios that you need to have leaders of within 48 hours. I said, well, let's actually look at this, because it was a lot of things. And many of them had climate in there, and DEI in there, and community cohesion in there. And so we gave it to our lawyers, and we said, how many of these are actually statutory? And of the 26 of them, it was just 2. Yeah. 2 were statutory. Now, we're not saying that we want to reduce the portfolios to 2,
sure,
but it shows that we take a very first principles approach to look, we're going to apply the same principles that Nigel will apply as Prime Minister at national level, locally. As I said, the levers of power are much smaller, but that doesn't mean we can't work really hard to do good, and that's what we'll do.
And in terms of HMOs, something you talked about over the weekend, explain sort of, for those watching, those homes of multiple occupancy, what that means, what sort of has been going on at local level there.
Well, it's something that most of you never really hear Labour talk about it, because most of the cabinet are totally insulated from it. I spent a lot of time on the campaign trail with Sarah Pochin, who's our new MP, in Runcorn.
Making a maiden speech today, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And she's awesome, by the way. She's going to be, I've gotten to know her well, she's going to be a formidable addition to British politics. But I struggle to think of something more emblematic of the disgraceful, catastrophic betrayal of the British people than this sort of thing, right? So what happens is you have a local community, and we all remember growing up, whatever, I grew up in a little, cul-de-sac estate, and we had a little local community. We knew who people were, and it meant kids could play outside without worry. And then what happens is a whole group of over 90% of them men, a significant percentage, often the majority, from countries like Iran, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, who have come to this country illegally, are then parachuted in and put inside what is actually quite a small residential accommodation, and paid for by the taxpayer, including the local community. And the culture that they have, I'm just going to say, is alien to the local community. And you can imagine how people feel. We hear reports all the time that parents are worried about letting their children play outside. They have to look particularly carefully at the school gates. By the way, these reports are not, I keep saying this is not in isolation. This is quite endemic. And why is this happening? And by the way, so they're calling it houses of multiple occupation because it means you have people who are not sort of tenants together. Yeah. It's not family inside these places. And the reason why this is happening at such industrial scale is because Serco, a massive contractor to the government, I think it might be one of their biggest, if not their biggest, are offering landlords 5 to 7 year gilt-edged contracts, 20% above market rates, and saying, we'll take care of all maintenance. Now, if you're a landlord, that kind of financial deal, money talks. And so local communities are being betrayed. And what took this scandal, in my view, to a whole new level, and this is why I said it is almost comic book in its villainy, is that British tenants, including in some cases, I can tell you, veterans who served our country valiantly, suffering from PTSD, are being evicted against their wishes, using something called a Section 21 notice.
Yeah.
Because the landlord, well, why wouldn't you? Because you've suddenly got this crazy Serco contract. So you have this unbelievable situation where people who have served this country with distinction and gallantry being turfed out to the curb in order to make space for people whose first act upon coming to this country was to break our laws. And frankly, some, not all, but some, are actively hostile to this country. We already know now one of the terrorists in this attempted attack was an asylum seeker. So nothing about this is remotely acceptable, James. And I'm afraid that the two old parties, they can say whatever they say, but Labour have active power to stop this immediately. And not only are they not stopping it, they're making it meaningfully worse. Small boat crossings are up 30% on a like-for-like basis since Starmer became Prime Minister. And the Tories had 14 years, and I mean, they are still, in my view, fundamentally responsible for all of this. So that's what's happening with HMOs. And in terms of what reform are going to try to do about it, now in government, we'd stop the boats. We talk about we'd deport everybody who's here illegally inside Nigel's first term, which would then obviously act as the ultimate deterrent from further people coming. And therefore, you're not going to need, and by the way, I will say this: if you are a landlord, and let's forget about Serco for a minute, but if you are a landlord and you're being presented with these gilt-edged contracts, I urge you to think very carefully about whether that is the right thing to do, and whether you have some kind of patriotic duty not to betray people like, as I said, these veterans who are now being turfed out.
And in terms of those giants like Serco, you're not worried about sort of legal action in terms of contracts, etc. Obviously, in terms of like what they can come to bear about if there's criticism, etc. I mean, getting embroiled with the government's one thing, and there's a sort of political element to that, but with these kind of outsourcing companies, there could be quite another sort of legal dimension.
Bring it on. Bring it on. I mean, our lawyers are working for free, and they're formidable lawyers. I mean, we're not going away, and we have a mandate to, as I said, I keep using the word resist. I can't guarantee we'll get to shut all of them down. I can't guarantee we're not going to lose some of these things. But again, to the degree we lose, it will not be because the actual law is not on our side. It's because the Home Secretary is doing the bidding of Serco. Look, Serco are a hugely powerful organisation with lots of lobbyists, and they have a lot of contracts. But look, are we scared of Serco's lawyers? No.
Just to return to something you said earlier, you're talking about how, when you made the point about DEI, you made the point that, it's not just about top line savings. It's not about sort of saving 10%. It's about resisting the mission creep that comes with such people in portfolios which are encouraging a sort of ratchet effect whereby sort of more spending on diversity, etc., more sort of additional responsibilities for local government. At the same time, of course, you get this sort of mini Leviathan overstretched whereby it's trying to do too much with too few resources and actually not focusing on the basic services you've talked about, like bin collection. I just wondered perhaps, I mean, for instance, one thing where the few growth industries over the past 15 years has been HR in this country. Actually, I rarely say this, but there's a fantastic piece in the New Statesman last year where they talked about the HRification. I think we proportionately have more staff in HR than any other country apart from the Netherlands. And will that be something, HR and local councils as well, because people are, that is also a significant cost to relative to other services.
Yeah, it's so funny. Sadly, this was a country that led most league tables in our history. Now the only tables we seem to lead are the deeply ignominious ones. I mean, whether it's HR people per capita or millionaires leaving per capita, it's all deeply troubling. But look, of course, I just want to be really clear about one thing.
Sure.
I am not saying that there is an important work to be done to reducing reducing spend in areas that are wasteful. That will drive significant savings ultimately. But you're absolutely right. There is an ideological element to this, and it's also why productivity in the civil service, for example, is not only getting worse, it's absolutely extremely low, much lower than in private sector places, right? And I think DEI and a lot of what HR does, not everything, but a lot of what HR does, actually reduces talent density inside organisations. I believe, as does everyone at Reform, Nigel and our MPs, we believe hiring should be merit-based and colour-blind. And it is an objective fact. You don't need to be a PhD in philosophy to understand that one has to choose between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. You literally cannot have both. If you say that half our board has to be of a certain skin colour or whatever it might be, and that is increasingly has been a decision many companies have made, stock exchanges have made. I'll tell you something really insidious about this, because I worked for some big American Wall Street banks who, at one point, certainly had very significant, industrialized HR teams. And so, for example, there would be these DEI programs, and they'd say, we need to make sure X percentage of our intern class or graduate class were from ethnic minorities. And almost invariably what would end up happening is I'd meet some people and said, I got in through that program. And it was a Nigerian kid who went to Epsom, right? It was an Indian kid whose father has a house in Kensington Palace Gardens that's worth £50 million. And that is worse than it looks. That's not just, but they look great in the corporate photo on the front of our investment report, which is all they care about, by the way. They absolutely do not care.
Well, I think, as you can see, why a lot of them have junked their programs recently, because they realised the sort of political premium that comes with that is now gone.
Yes, yeah. So they are not scrapping it because they've come to their senses about the reality. It's just because they've sensed the political winds have changed. But you know what's really insidious is that if you are a white working class boy who grows up on a council estate in Runcorn, those people are literally taking away places that should have been allocated. So to the degree you are going to do some kind of program to get talent that might not otherwise get through for, let's say, structural reasons. Like, I'm open to the idea that might be true. But that's got nothing to do with skin color in this country, or far less to do with that. Much more to do with class. And I remember I gave a speech a long time ago. I was still running my company at a school in East London, where it was about 30-40% ethnic minorities in that school, state school, rough part of London. And I remember I gave a speech, and I actually talked a little bit about this stuff. And I remember a kid's mum was there, and she was literally in tears. And she said, my son I want him to go to Oxford one day, but there's no programs for him. No one wants to help him. And this, by the way, was an extremely bright kid who asked really smart questions. And so that's why, you go back to the ideological aspect of this. What we have to do, and what we do really care about, Nigel spent decades trying to do this, is say, this should be a country that once again goes back to equality before the law. I mean, we haven't even talked about how this has infected policing. If you report crime in this country, probably the majority of it now, to the disdain of the police officers, frankly, is spent asking you what religion you are, what skin colour you are, who you've been going to bed with.
I mean, imagine a lot of this stuff is going to be a textbook for the next PCC elections. I mean, I know that's a long way off, but that's going to be a key thing in terms of what they're looking into and sort of some of the political priorities of these police chiefs, which are supposed to stand up for communities.
Yeah, and again, I keep saying this. We are not a party that's just going to talk about these things because a focus group said it would do well. As I said, we're going to work really hard. Hopefully you can already see that in the first few days, and you can expect that to continue. We are going to discharge our mandate to the fullest degree we can. We will be relentless. We are going to bring the fight to the. There's almost going to be an immune response. There always is, right? There's an immune response inside the bureaucracy that has been so captured by many of these, frankly, Marxist concepts. We should expect that. We're not angry about it. We're not even frustrated by it. We're prepared for it. But we will. Just as we worked really hard to outmaneuver and outwork the old parties in winning those elections, we will do the same with the bureaucracy.
I mean, obviously, the key thing is to prevent sort of capture of your sort of elected representatives. I mean, one part of that is obviously becoming part of the bureaucracy, becoming part of the old machine in some ways. But the other point is, I think, perhaps is just at a small level. I mean, we've talked about corruption, but just in terms of kind of the incentives when it comes to planning, for instance, there's plenty of stories in places like privatised rotten boroughs about sort of councillors, getting lobbied, etc., whether it be freebies, etc. Will you take a very strong line against that kind of thing creeping into the Reform Party?
Yeah, we will. We will. I mean, I've done Zoom calls at this stage, in person soon. In fact, we're bringing all our councillors across the country down to a conference in London on Saturday.
This Saturday.
This Saturday. We're moving fast. But what I've said to all in this Zoom call is, look, if you're caught up in one of those scandals, then in the end, you should expect us to respond in the way it would be appropriate for a party that has stood up very much against that sort of thing. And I'm not going to claim that every Reform elected representative is going to be perfect, but we're going to be meaningfully better than the two old parties. And as I said, we have got teams going in who are going to be working very closely with with the councillors, the council leaders, and the executive teams to get to the bottom of where taxpayers' money is going, why there is a seemingly bottomless pit that seems to... And by the way, they always blame social care. Like, yes, so two things can be true at the same time, James. It can be true that there are severe and significant demands being placed on a statutory basis of local councils by social care, and that getting those special educational needs kids to school on time is critically important and sacrosanct to us. It can also be true that vast amounts of taxpayers' money is being wasted, at the minimum wasted, and as I said, in some cases I think we're going to find it's being stolen.
And tell us a bit about the sort of the people who just got elected. I mean, obviously you sort of won sort of nearly 700 councillors, but are there any sort of names that sort of jump out? I think one of them is your new leader of Kent County Council is Lyndon, who used to work here at the Spectator, actually, fun enough. But are there any sort of ones you sort of pick out? Because I also make the point that I think that presumably some of these councillors are going to presumably be your candidates for national government next time at the general election of 2029. Yeah,
so look, I've actually been hugely impressed by the calibre of the people who've been elected. I'm not surprised by it because obviously I was looking after the selection process and the procurement process for candidates. I mean, we've got CEOs of AI companies, we've got people with who have significant experience in road maintenance. And so, it's funny, as we set up these task forces, the DOGE and potholes and, the resistance to dispersal of illegal migrants, I don't really need to look much farther than the 677 people that we got elected. They're really formidable people. As I say, Lyndon's great. And by the way, she's going to turn up to the first meeting wearing a turquoise jacket. And look, she's great. But they're all people who are deeply patriotic. Most of them are new to politics. I'd estimate 90% of them are new to politics. And to me, that's a great thing. In the end, these are people who have had no hand, who are unsullied by an appalling incumbency and track record. We are going to be working really hard to give them, so that's what we're bringing all of them down to London on Saturday for the first sort of academy day, where we will be helping them, again, really understand the mechanics of government. But it's also so often in life, and this happens a lot in business, people who come at things with a completely fresh perspective, they're not encumbered by all the norms that have just resulted in the appalling state of these local councils up until now. I mean, even look at the flag thing, right? Where just saying that we think local government should not be flying the flags of foreign countries or flying the flags of overt political movements apparently seems to be hugely controversial. We don't think it is. And so you're going to see our councils pass resolutions in service of that. Similarly, when we think about, as I said, potholes, bin collections, our councillors are people, as I said, many of them have experience of that procurement process. Partly what motivated them and animates them to want to get into local government. In terms of MPs, look, a lot of people, as you can imagine, come and say, I'd love to be an MP in 2029. Sure. And my answer universally is great. Go and apply to be a council candidate. Because we have an opportunity to do something. So it's a corollary of the insane challenge that we had and still have, but it just seems a lot more realistic now than it did 11 months ago when we had, zero MPs. No party has ever gone from, 14% of the vote share in one election cycle to winning a majority in the House of Commons, I'd say 31, 32. Now, by the way, we won 31%, 32%
last week,
so that already is historic. But you're also talking about going from 5 MPs through to 326 at a minimum.
Massive challenge.
But if we do that, then obviously you're going to have a whole class of MPs where at least the vast majority are new to politics or new to being an MP. So the analogy I like to use is like Barcelona's academy. Yeah. So no other party could really ever do this, right? Where I often sat and thought, why is it, as someone quite new to politics, I only came into politics last summer, why is it that people who sit in the cabinet in this country, pretty much throughout my entire life, have not only been incompetent, but some of the least competent, appallingly shambolic people you could possibly find. And if that keeps happening, Matt Hancock and Rachel, I mean, how these people, and how we had Matt Hancock as our health secretary during the greatest health emergency, I'd argue, of since World War II. Yeah. But this is not by accident. The outcome of the system, if that keeps happening, you have to assume that's endemic. So why is it happening? It's because in order to become leader of one of the two old parties, you have to buy off you have
It's
to horse
incentives,
trade.
right? The misincentives or disincentives. Yeah.
You have to buy off a whole load of MPs who are just very good at garnering lots of support and power maximising in the short term. And power maximising in the short term is exactly why the country is in the situation that it's in. So if you look at Barcelona's team, by the time the players come through and are playing in the first team, Barcelona know a huge amount about those players. Most of the time, they've known them since they were 13 or 14. Now, we're not going to have quite that level of
They play the same
about
system,
them.
haven't they? The La Masia, they play the way they do.
Exactly. So for us, it's like, well, if you've come forward and stood as a candidate, I sincerely hope of those 677 who just got elected, I genuinely hope that a meaningful percentage of our MPs class comes from that group. Why? Because they would have come forward early, stuck their head above the parapet when it wasn't, they're certainly not Johnny-come-latelys.
Yeah.
They've demonstrated they can fight a great campaign, and they have the courage to do so. They've demonstrated they can govern effectively. They've demonstrated they can listen to their constituents and not get embroiled in scandal and deliver on their mandate. And so if you do that, why wouldn't you want those people to be MPs?
But I mean, suppose next year it's going to be really hard because this time there were sort of 1,600 candidates up for election across the country. Yeah. Next year you've got 1,800 in London alone. Yep. It's going to be a huge challenge to upscale. And I suppose the criticism some might have would be, well, hang on a sec, you've got your best people just elected. Yeah. How do you kind of keep finding the people to keep that high standard and field them across the country?
Well, they're different places. Yeah. So I mean, look,
of course,
it's 4,500. Plus Wales, plus Scotland.
Yep.
And I always say, we know the game we're in. It's like Tetris, right? You never win it really. The game just keeps getting harder. But look, we're up for the challenge. And I will say, pretty much every week since I've been chairman of this party, the caliber of talent coming forward wanting to help, both above the line, in the public eye, and behind the scenes, continues to grow exponentially. So it won't be easy. Nothing about this is easy. I think we've already demonstrated to people, look, it was only 8 to 10 months ago, people were saying, quite learned people, Farage parties, and I'm quoting, are capped at 15%. He surrounds himself with people who have no idea how to build things. I mean, and again, the opposite is true. Nigel is capable of attracting some of the most formidable talent in this country. And the evidence of that is what we just delivered on the 1st of May, when we went up against, and we had to fight that parliamentary by-election and go up against Labour's artillery.
Yeah,
in one of
best
their
machine,
heartlands.
Northwest,
Alongside, why do you think they did it on May the 1st?
Obviously to time and to distract resources.
Because they thought it would distribute our resources and spread us thin. And that was true. We still beat them, albeit by a slender margin, but we beat them. And look, again, we take nothing for granted. We're certainly not complacent. But we've got awesome people coming forward wanting to help us. And look, we're mission driven. We all know why it is. And I think that's difficult for a lot of people to understand. In business, culture of a business is critical, right? It defines... you can go to an Apple store today and you still feel Steve Jobs' presence inside that store. And everybody at this party, Ed, who's our head of press, who's over there, and everybody else in and around Nigel is mission driven, understands why we're all here. It's why Sarah joined us. So look, is it going to be, it's literally going to be 3 times harder to field high quality candidates next year as this year, but we'll do it.
I look forward to covering it on Spectator TV. Zia Yusuf, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.